They thought she was begging when she knelt in the middle of town, but by sunrise, they would realize she had come to judge them. The dust hung low over Red Hollow that afternoon, drifting in slow, lazy spirals between boots and wagon wheels, the kind of dry heat that made tempers short and silence heavy. And right there in the center of it all, an elderly woman lay half-kneeling in the dirt, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself while laughter circled her like vultures that had already decided she didn't belong among the living. No one stepped forward, not the shopkeeper leaning against his doorframe, not the men playing cards in the shade, not even the sheriff who watched from across the street with a hand resting on his belt and eyes that refused to meet hers. Because out here, kindness had a way of costing more than most were willing to pay, and everyone knew it. Everyone except one man standing at the edge of the street, still as a fence post, watching the scene unfold like something he'd seen before and never forgotten. Ethan Cole didn't look like much to them, just another cowboy passing through, dust on his coat, hat pulled low, the kind of man people overlooked until they didn't. And for a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as the old woman tried again to rise and failed, her worn dress catching on the rough ground, her breath shallow, her dignity slipping away 1 inch at a time under the weight of a town that had already decided what she was worth. And then something shifted, subtle as a change in wind direction, and Ethan stepped forward, his boots pressed into the dirt with quiet certainty, each step measured, unhurried, like a man who understood exactly what he was walking into and chose it anyway. And when he reached her, he didn't ask questions, didn't look around for approval. He simply crouched, offered his hand, and said in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "Easy now," as if the world hadn't just turned its back on her. The laughter didn't stop. If anything, it sharpened, cutting through the heat with cruel amusement. But Ethan didn't look up, didn't acknowledge them. He just helped her to her feet, steadying her with a care that felt almost out of place in a town like this. And for a second, just a second, the woman's eyes met his, dark and searching, as if trying to understand why a stranger would risk being seen standing beside her. And then she reached into the folds of her sleeve and pressed something small into his hand, something soft and worn, fabric stitched with patterns that didn't belong to this town. And she whispered, barely audible, "You shouldn't have done that." Not as a warning, not quite, but as if she knew something he didn't. Ethan glanced down at the cloth, then back at her. But she had already stepped away, pulling herself upright with a quiet strength that hadn't been there a moment before. And without another word, she moved down the street, leaving behind the same silence she had entered with. Except now it felt different, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer, the small piece of cloth resting in his palm, the heat pressing in around him. And though no one said it out loud, every eye in town followed him as he turned and walked away. Because out here, a man didn't step into something like that without it coming back around. And as the sun dipped lower behind the hills, stretching shadows long across the street, a feeling settled over Red Hollow that none of them could quite name, only that by morning, something would arrive with the dust, and it wouldn't be asking for permission. By the time the sun slipped behind the ridge and the last light bled out across the rooftops, Red Hollow had already decided what kind of man Ethan Cole was, and none of their guesses were kind. They watched him from behind half-closed shutters and from the corners of the saloon, voices kept low but sharp, as if speaking too loud might draw his attention, and with it the trouble they were certain followed him now. Because a man did not step between a crowd and someone they had chosen to cast out, without inviting consequence. And everyone in that town understood consequence better than they understood mercy. Ethan, for his part, did not linger in the street long after the old woman disappeared. He moved the way he always did. Quiet, deliberate, like a man used to being alone, cutting across the dusty road toward the edge of town where his horse was tied to a weathered post, the leather saddle warm from the afternoon heat, the animal shifting slightly as he approached, sensing the weight in its rider before he even placed a hand on the reins. He paused there, just for a moment, the small piece of cloth still resting in his palm, and he turned it over once, twice, studying the stitching that caught what little light remained, patterns tight and careful, not decorative in the way town folk understood decoration, but meaningful in a way that carried something older, something that did not belong to Red Hollow. And he frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of something he could not quite place, like a memory just out of reach. A voice broke through his thoughts, rough and edged with warning. You planning to keep that, or you just collecting trouble now? Ethan did not need to turn to know who it was. Sheriff Wallace had a way of standing that filled space without moving. And sure enough, the man stepped closer, boots slow against the dirt, eyes fixed not on Ethan's face but on the cloth in his hand, as if that small thing carried more weight than either of them wanted to admit, and Ethan answered without looking up. It was given. Simple, flat, the kind of answer that did not invite further questions, but Wallace was not a man who let things rest easy. You do not know who she was, the sheriff said, lowering his voice as if the buildings themselves might be listening. And you sure do not know what you just stepped into. And there it was again, that tone people used when they thought they understood the rules of a place better than the man standing in front of them. And Ethan finally lifted his gaze, meeting Wallace's eyes with a calm that felt heavier than defiance. Looked like someone who needed a hand, he said, and for a second, just a second, the sheriff hesitated, like he wanted to argue but could not find the words that would make sense of what he was feeling. And instead he exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Out here, that kind of thinking gets a man noticed, he muttered, before stepping back, leaving the warning hanging in the air like dust that refused to settle. Ethan did not respond. He simply tucked the cloth into his coat, tightened the strap on his saddle, and swung himself up in one smooth motion, the leather creaking under his weight as the horse shifted beneath him. And without another glance at the town, he guided the animal toward the narrow trail that led just beyond the last row of buildings, where the land opened up into quiet stretches of dry grass and scattered rock, a place where a man could breathe without feeling watched. But even as he rode out, the silence did not feel like peace. It felt like waiting, like the kind of stillness that comes before something changes. And back in Red Hollow, long after the last lantern was lit and doors were bolted shut, people found themselves listening for sounds that did not belong to the night. A distant rhythm carried on the wind, too steady to be chance, too measured to be nothing at all. And though no one said it out loud, the same thought settled into every corner of that town. Whatever was coming, it was already on its way. The night stretched long across the open land, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel like it carried meaning. And Ethan Cole rode beneath a sky scattered with cold stars, his horse moving at an easy pace along the narrow trail that curved through dry grass and low brush. The town of Red Hollow already shrinking behind him into a cluster of dim lantern light. But the weight he carried did not fade with distance. It settled deeper, steady and patient, like something waiting for the right moment to speak. He reached the small rise where he had made camp before, a worn patch of earth sheltered by a crooked mesquite tree, and he dismounted without hurry, tying the reins loose enough for the horse to graze while he crouched near the remnants of an old fire pit, brushing away ash with the side of his boot, movements practiced, efficient, a man who knew how to live with little and ask for less. And yet tonight, there was something different in the air, not danger, not yet, but a presence, subtle as the shift of wind before a storm that never quite shows itself, until it is already there. He reached into his coat and pulled out the cloth the old woman had given him. Holding it up to the faint glow of the fire, he coaxed back to life, and for the first time, he studied it properly, not as a curiosity, but as something that might explain why the sheriff's voice had carried that edge, why the town had gone so still after she left, and the patterns revealed themselves slowly. Lines and shapes woven with care, not random, not decorative, but deliberate, like a message written in a language meant to be felt before it was understood. And as his fingers traced the stitching, a memory brushed against him, faint but insistent, of a woman years ago who had once told him that some things were not meant to be taken lightly, that certain gifts carried weight far beyond what they looked like. And he exhaled quietly, lowering the cloth as the firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that moved like thoughts he had not yet put into words. The horse lifted its head suddenly, ears turning toward the darkness beyond the ridge, and Ethan stilled, not reaching for anything, not reacting in haste, just listening. Because out here, listening mattered more than anything else. And at first there was nothing. only the soft rustle of grass and the distant cry of something moving far off in the night. But then it came, faint, steady, a rhythm carried on the wind, not loud enough to be called sound, not clear enough to be named, but consistent, measured, like many things moving together with purpose, and Ethan did not need to see it to understand what it meant, because whatever had begun back in that town had not ended when he rode away. It had only shifted, following its own path, closing distance 1 mile at a time. He fed a small piece of wood into the fire and watched as the flame caught, steady and controlled, and he did not rush to put it out, did not hide his presence, because something told him that hiding would not change what was coming. And after a while, he leaned back against the tree, hat tipped low, the cloth still resting in his hand, and though his posture was relaxed, there was a quiet awareness in the way he held himself, like a man who had made peace with whatever might arrive, not because he expected trouble, but because he understood that some things were not about trouble at all. They were about consequence, about meaning, about the way one small choice could travel farther than the man who made it ever intended. Somewhere beyond the ridge, that rhythm grew just slightly stronger, still distant, still hidden, but no longer uncertain, and the night, which had once felt empty, now felt full, as if the land itself was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The fire burned low and steady through the night, its glow barely pushing back the darkness that pressed in from all sides. And Ethan Cole did not sleep so much as rest with his eyes closed, listening in that way men like him learned long ago, where silence spoke louder than sound and stillness carried more truth than motion. And sometime before dawn, that distant rhythm he had felt rather than heard shifted, not closer in noise, but closer in presence, like something had crossed an invisible line and was now part of the same space he occupied. And his eyes opened slowly, not in alarm, just in acknowledgement. The sky was beginning to pale along the horizon, a thin band of gray stretching over the land, and the air held that cold edge that came just before sunrise, when the world seemed suspended between one thing and the next. And Ethan sat up, reaching for the small cloth without looking, his fingers finding it easily where he had set it beside him, and for a moment he simply held it there, feeling its weight, its texture, as if it might tell him what the rest of the world refused to say out loud. His horse shifted again, not startled, but aware, turning its head toward the ridge that rose about a quarter mile to the east, and this time, Ethan followed the movement, his gaze lifting slowly to meet the faint outline of that rise against the growing light. And at first, there was nothing there, just the shape of land against sky. But then the light changed, just enough to reveal shadows that had not been there before, long and still, lined along the ridge in a way that was too deliberate to be natural, and Ethan did not move, did not reach for anything, because he understood something in that moment that most men in his place would not, that whatever stood there had not come in haste, had not come in anger, it had come with purpose, and purpose did not rush. One shadow became 2, then 5, then more, resolving slowly as the light grew stronger, figures mounted on horses, sitting straight and silent, their presence defined not by movement, but by the absence of it. And even at that distance, there was something unmistakable in the way they held themselves, a discipline that did not need to be displayed, a unity that did not need to be spoken. And Ethan exhaled quietly, not in fear, not in surprise, but in recognition that the night had delivered exactly what it had promised. The line of riders did not advance, did not call out. They simply remained where they were, watching, waiting, as if allowing the moment to unfold in its own time. And the stillness between them stretched, not empty, but full, charged with something that felt older than the land itself. And Ethan slowly pushed himself to his feet, brushing the dust from his coat with one hand while the other held the cloth, his movements unhurried, deliberate, matching the pace of what stood before him, because he understood now that this was not about confrontation, not about conflict, but about something far more precise, something that required patience more than force. The sun edged higher, spilling light across the ridge, and with it came clarity, revealing the riders in full, dozens of them, perhaps more, arranged in a line that followed the curve of the land, their horses still, their eyes fixed not on the camp, not on the fire, but on him. And yet there was no hostility in that gaze, no urgency, only a quiet intensity that made the air feel heavier, and Ethan stood there, alone beneath the tree, the fire at his back, the cloth in his hand, facing something that had crossed miles of open country not to chase, not to threaten, but to arrive. And as the first full light of morning broke over the horizon, one figure at the center of that line shifted slightly, guiding her horse forward just a few steps, enough to separate from the others, enough to be seen, and though the distance still lay between them, there was no mistaking who she was, not because he had seen her before, but because the entire moment seemed to gather around her presence, like everything that had led here now stood waiting for what she would do next. The woman did not rush when she moved, and that was the first thing Ethan noticed. Not her face, not the way the others behind her remained perfectly still, but the pace, slow and certain, like every step her horse took had already been decided long before this morning. And as she descended the gentle slope of the ridge, the light caught along the edges of her figure, revealing details one at a time. The dark braid resting over her shoulder, the simple lines of her clothing marked with patterns that echoed the cloth in Ethan's hand, and something in his chest tightened, not with fear, but with understanding that had been forming quietly since the moment that old woman had looked at him in the dust. She stopped when she was still some distance away, perhaps 30 yards, far enough to show respect, close enough that there was no mistaking intention, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them filled with the quiet presence of everything unsaid, while behind her, the line of riders remained unchanged, watching, waiting, not as a threat, but as witnesses. Ethan did not step forward, did not raise a hand. He simply stood where he was, the cloth held loosely at his side, his posture open, steady, the way a man stands when he has nothing to hide and nothing to prove. And the woman studied him with a gaze that did not waver, not searching for weakness, not measuring him the way others might, but reading something deeper, something that could not be faked or forced. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried across the distance with a calm clarity that seemed to settle into the ground itself. "You are the one," she said, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a simple acknowledgement, and Ethan gave the smallest nod, not because he knew what she meant, but because he understood that denying it would change nothing. Her eyes lowered then, not to the ground, but to his hand, to the cloth he still held, and something shifted in her. Expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a piece of a larger truth falling into place. And she guided her horse forward another few steps before stopping again, this time close enough that the details of her face became clear, the strength in her features, the quiet control in the way she held herself. And still, there was no anger there, no sign of the retribution the town had feared, only something steadier, something harder to name. "She found you," the woman said, her voice softer now, though no less certain, and Ethan glanced down briefly at the cloth before answering. She needed help. The words simple, unadorned, and for the first time, a faint change touched the woman's gaze, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something that carried both, and she inclined her head slightly, a gesture that felt less like thanks and more like recognition, as if acknowledging a truth she had expected but still needed to see with her own eyes. Behind her, one of the riders shifted, not forward, not back, just enough to signal awareness, and Ethan's attention flickered briefly in that direction before returning to her, because whatever this was, whatever had brought them here, it centered on her, on the quiet gravity she carried with her presence, and the air between them seemed to hold that weight, steady and unmoving. She drew a slow breath, her gaze lifting past Ethan for just a moment, toward the distant line of red hollow barely visible beyond the rise. And when she spoke again, her words carried something new, not directed at him alone, but at the space behind him, at the place where this had begun. "They watched," she said, the statement simple, but layered, and Ethan did not need her to explain who she meant, because he had seen it too, the way the town had stood back, the way silence had done more than any action could have, and he gave a small nod, his voice quiet when he answered. "They always do." And for a moment, that was all there was, the truth of it hanging between them like something both understood and accepted. The woman looked back at him then, fully, her expression settling into something resolute, and without raising her voice, without any gesture of command, she spoke again. Then they will see this as well. And though her tone did not change, the meaning behind it shifted everything, because whatever came next was not meant for him alone. It was meant to travel back across that distance, to reach the town that had chosen to watch instead of act. And as the wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the faint scent of dust and leather, Ethan realized that what had arrived with the morning was not judgment in the way men understood it, but something far more enduring, something that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. The words settled into the morning air and did not fade. They remained there between them, quiet and unmovable, like something carved into the land itself. And for a long second, nothing changed, not the wind, not the posture of the riders along the ridge, not even the soft shifting of Ethan's horse behind him. But beneath that stillness, something had already begun to move, something unseen yet unmistakable, because meaning, once spoken, does not wait for permission to take shape. The woman turned her head slightly, not toward Ethan, but toward the line of riders behind her, and she did not raise her voice, did not signal with her hands. Yet the response came all the same, subtle at first, a single rider guiding his horse forward, then another, then several more, not breaking formation, not rushing, but adjusting, reshaping the line into something that felt less like a boundary and more like a presence. A quiet unfolding of intent that required no explanation. Ethan watched it happen without tension in his stance, his gaze steady, following the movement not as a threat, but as a pattern revealing itself. And when he looked back at the woman, she was already watching him again, as if measuring not his reaction, but his understanding. And there was a moment, brief but clear, where something passed between them, not spoken, not defined, but recognized. The kind of understanding that does not belong to words. She moved then, guiding her horse a few steps closer, closing the distance just enough that her voice, when she spoke again, no longer had to travel across open ground. "You stood when no one else did," she said, and though the sentence was simple, it carried weight, not praise, not gratitude, but acknowledgement, the kind that could not be given lightly, and Ethan answered in the same quiet tone. She was alone, as if that explained everything, and perhaps it did, because the woman held his gaze for a moment longer before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. The riders behind her began to shift again, this time not forward, but outward, spreading slightly along the ridge, their formation widening, opening, as if making space rather than closing it, and the movement, though controlled, carried a presence that could not be ignored, not by the land, not by the town beyond it, and not by the man standing beneath the tree. The woman turned her horse just enough to face the distant outline of Red Hollow, her posture straight, composed, and for the first time, Ethan followed her gaze fully, looking past her, past the ridge, to where the town sat under the rising sun, small and still, unaware, or perhaps already aware of what had arrived just beyond its reach. And he could almost feel it, the way the morning carried something back in that direction, something that would reach them not as sound, but as sight, as understanding, as consequence. "They will remember this," the woman said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a certainty that did not need volume, and Ethan did not respond right away, because he understood that memory, the kind she spoke of, was not something that could be chosen or avoided. It settled into people whether they wanted it or not, shaping what came after in ways they would only recognize much later. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost thoughtful. "Maybe that is enough." And the woman glanced back at him, just slightly, as if considering that, before her expression softened in a way that did not diminish her presence, but added to it, like strength choosing not to prove itself. She reached down then, slowly, deliberately, and placed her hand over her chest for a brief moment, a gesture simple in motion but deep in meaning. And though Ethan did not mirror it, he inclined his head just a fraction, acknowledging it in his own way, and the space between them shifted again, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but settled into something complete. Behind her, the riders came to stillness once more, their positions now wider, their presence no less powerful, but no longer contained to a single line, and the morning light spread across them, revealing not an army, not a threat, but a gathering that had come and would soon leave, not to take anything, but to leave something behind that could not be seen, only felt, only remembered. And as the wind moved through the grass once more, carrying with it the quiet echo of everything that had just passed, Ethan understood that what stood before him was not an ending, but a message, one that had already begun its journey back toward the town, where it would arrive without sound and remain long after the riders were gone. The shift began so quietly that if a man had not been watching for it, he might have missed it entirely. Just a ripple along the ridge where the riders stood, a subtle tightening of posture, a collective awareness turning in the same direction at once, not toward Ethan, but beyond him, toward the distant outline of Red Hollow, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. That same sense of movement carried not by sound but by intention, the kind that traveled faster than hooves ever could. The woman did not move at first, her gaze still steady, her presence unchanged, but her eyes followed the same distant point, and for a moment, both of them stood there in silence, looking toward the town as if something there had answered without speaking. And then Ethan saw it, faint at first, a thin line of dust rising from the far side of the buildings, too organized to be wind, too deliberate to be chance. And he knew without needing to ask that the town had chosen not to remain still this time. The riders behind the woman did not react with alarm, did not break formation or reach for anything. They simply watched, their stillness holding, their presence unchanged, and that, more than anything, seemed to shape the moment, because what was coming from the town was movement born of uncertainty, while what stood on the ridge was something far steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. The dust grew thicker, resolving slowly into figures, a small group at first, then more, men on horseback, some riding close together, others hanging back, their approach uneven, lacking the quiet unity of those already waiting. And as they drew closer, details became clearer, the glint of metal in the morning light, the familiar shape of Sheriff Wallace at the front, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed ahead, not on Ethan, not on the woman, but on the line of riders that stretched across the ridge like something he did not yet understand. Ethan did not move from where he stood, his weight balanced, his hands relaxed at his sides, the cloth still tucked safely within his coat, and though the distance between all of them began to close, the feeling of the moment did not tighten into confrontation, it remained something else entirely. Something suspended, waiting to see which direction it would take. The woman finally shifted, not in response to the approaching group, but as if acknowledging that their arrival had been expected, her horse turning just enough to square her position between Ethan and the town, not as a barrier, but as a point of focus. And when the riders from Red Hollow slowed, their horses stepping uncertainly as they reached the edge of the open ground, the contrast became clear. On one side, men who had come because they did not know what else to do, and on the other, those who had come because they already did. Sheriff Wallace brought his horse to a halt some distance away, his eyes moving across the ridge, counting, measuring, searching for something that would make sense of what he was seeing. But there was no single answer to be found there, only the quiet presence of many who did not need to explain themselves. And when his gaze finally settled on Ethan, there was a question in it, unspoken but heavy, as if asking what he had brought upon them all. And Ethan held that look without changing his own, not offering explanation, not offering defense, because whatever this was, it had moved beyond the kind of answers the town was used to. The wind passed between them, carrying the scent of dry earth and leather, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The space filled instead with the weight of what each side had brought with them. Fear on one side, certainty on the other, and somewhere in between, a man who had simply chosen to help when it would have been easier not to. And the woman, still at the center of it all, looked from Ethan to the men of Red Hollow, her expression calm, unwavering, and in that stillness, it became clear that whatever would happen next would not be decided by who had more men, or who spoke louder, but by something far quieter, something already set in motion long before any of them had arrived. No one spoke at first, and that silence did more than any shouted command ever could. It stretched across the open ground between the ridge and the town riders, pressing into every man there until even the restless shifting of horses seemed too loud for the moment. And Sheriff Wallace was the first to break under it, not with anger, not with authority, but with uncertainty that showed in the way he cleared his throat before speaking. "We do not want trouble," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the woman, though it lacked the weight he might have hoped for. And the words hung there, fragile, as if even he did not fully believe them. The woman did not answer immediately. She did not even look at him at first. Her gaze remained on Ethan for a breath longer, as if confirming something only she could see. And then she turned slowly, her attention shifting to the men of Red Hollow. And when her eyes settled on them, it was not with anger or accusation, but with something far more unsettling, a calm that seemed to measure without needing to ask. She guided her horse forward just a few steps, enough to stand clearly between both sides. And when she spoke, her voice carried evenly across the space. "You watched," she said, the same words as before, but now they landed differently. Now they had an audience, and several of the men shifted in their saddles, glancing at one another as if hoping someone else might answer for them. But no one did. Wallace straightened slightly, trying to recover the authority he wore like a badge. "We did not know what was happening," he replied, though the words came slower than they should have. And the woman tilted her head just slightly, not in disbelief, not in challenge, but in a way that made the answer feel smaller than it had sounded. "You knew enough," she said quietly, and there was no sharpness in it, no edge, only truth, simple and unadorned. And that made it heavier than anything louder could have been. Ethan stood where he was, saying nothing. His presence no longer the center of the moment, but still part of it, like a stone dropped into water whose ripples had now reached the shore. And as the silence returned, something changed again, subtle but undeniable. The riders behind the woman shifted once more, not forward, not outward, but downward, and one by one, in a movement so measured it felt almost ceremonial, they began to dismount, boots touching the ground with quiet purpose, each man stepping to stand beside his horse rather than above it. And the effect was immediate, not threatening, not aggressive, but grounding, as if they had chosen to meet the moment not with height or distance, but with presence. The men from the town watched this with growing unease, not because of what was being done, but because of what it meant, because they could not read it in the way they understood displays of force and uncertainty, more than anything else, as a way of unraveling confidence. The woman dismounted last, her movement smooth, unhurried, and when her boots met the earth, she stood tall, her posture steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, and for a moment, she said nothing, allowing the weight of the moment to settle fully, allowing the silence to speak where words would only clutter. Then, without raising her voice, she stepped forward a single pace, her eyes moving across the faces of the men from Red Hollow, not searching for one in particular, but seeing all of them at once. And when she spoke again, it was not to accuse, not to threaten, but to reveal something they could not step away from. "He did what you would not," she said, her voice calm, certain, and though she did not turn toward Ethan, her words made it clear who she meant, and in that instant, the truth of it settled over the town riders like a weight they could not shift, because it was not a matter of right or wrong as they understood it. It was simpler than that, and far more difficult to deny. No one reached for anything. No one raised a hand, and yet the moment felt more decisive than any confrontation could have been, because what stood between them now was not fear, but clarity, and clarity, once seen, cannot be unseen. And as the morning light continued to rise, illuminating every face, every posture, every quiet reaction, it became clear that whatever had come here had already done what it was meant to do, not through force, not through demand, but through something far quieter, something that left no room for denial. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like a weight being slowly set down, and in that quiet, something inside the men from Red Hollow began to change, not loudly, not in a way they could point to or name, but in the small ways that matter most, the way shoulders lowered, the way eyes dropped for just a second longer than before, the way no one reached for authority because none of it seemed to fit the moment anymore. Sheriff Wallace sat there on his horse, his jaw set tight, but the certainty he had ridden out with had already begun to loosen. And when he looked from the woman to Ethan and back again, there was something different in his gaze now. Not fear, not anger, but something closer to understanding, the kind that comes too late to undo what has already been done, but just in time to change what comes next. The woman stood still, her presence unchanged, not pressing, not demanding, simply allowing the truth of what she had spoken to settle where it needed to. And, after a long moment, she turned her head slightly toward Ethan, her expression softening just enough to be seen, and with a calm, deliberate motion, she reached into the fold of her garment and drew out a small object, a pendant of worn silver wrapped around a piece of turquoise stone, its surface catching the morning light in a way that felt almost quiet despite its brightness. And she stepped forward, closing the last few feet between them, her boots steady against the earth, and she held the pendant out to him, not as a reward, not as payment, but as something far more deliberate. Ethan did not take it right away. He looked at it, then at her, reading the meaning in the gesture rather than the object itself, and when he finally reached out, his hand moved slowly, carefully, as if accepting not just what was offered, but everything that came with it. And the moment his fingers closed around the pendant, the woman inclined her head once, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than any words could have. Behind her, the riders began to move again, not toward the town, not toward Ethan, but away, each man turning his horse with the same quiet precision they had arrived with. No signal given, no command spoken, and yet they moved as one, their purpose complete, their presence already becoming memory even as they stood there, and one by one, they mounted, settling back into their saddles with the same calm they had carried from the beginning. The men from Red Hollow watched in silence, no one calling out, no one trying to stop them, because there was nothing to stop, nothing to argue against, only something to witness and carry with them. The woman stepped back, giving space again, her gaze lingering on Ethan for just a second longer, and in that look was something unspoken but clear, not gratitude in the way people expected, but recognition, the kind that does not fade with distance or time. And then she turned her horse, joining the others without hesitation, becoming part of the line once more, and as they began to ride, the sound of hooves was soft, measured, fading slowly into the open land, leaving behind nothing but dust that settled quickly and a silence that felt different than the one before, heavier, but also clearer. Ethan stood there for a moment after they were gone, the pendant resting in his hand, the small cloth still tucked against his chest, and he did not look back at the town right away. Because he did not need to. He could feel it. The way the place behind him had changed, not in its buildings or its streets, but in the people who now carried something they had not carried before. When he finally turned, the men from Red Hollow were still there, but they did not look the same, not quite, and Sheriff Wallace met his gaze once more, no words passing between them, none needed, and after a second, the sheriff gave the smallest nod, not to Ethan alone, but to the moment itself, and then he turned his horse back toward town, the others following without question, quieter than when they had come. Ethan watched them go for a breath, then two, before he slipped the pendant into his coat, adjusted the saddle on his horse, and mounted. Without ceremony, guiding the animal toward the open land in the opposite direction, and as he rode, the morning stretched wide before him, empty and full all at once, and somewhere behind him, in a town that would not forget this day, something had settled that no law could right and no gun could enforce, something quieter, something stronger, something that would remain long after the dust had cleared, because out here, justice did not always arrive with noise, sometimes it came in silence, carried by those who chose to act when others did not, and it left behind only one thing that mattered, the understanding that a single moment of kindness could travel farther than any man ever could.